Director Partners in Humanity for Muslim Western Understanding for Searching for Common Ground, in many ways a practitioner of cultural diplomacy, so we're very happy to have you here with us today. Professor Dr. Muhammad Quibria, right here, who is Professor at Department of Economics at Morgan State University. We thought it wasn't good to have a panel like this just with a bunch of cultural diplomats, so I'm very happy to have an economist here to help bring in also some very important perspectives from his side. We also have Professor Dr. Tom Palmer, Executive Vice President for International Programs, Atlas Network, and Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. If you could also raise your hand there as well, Tom Palmer. We also have Professor Dr. Daryl Harris, Professor of Political Science, Department at Howard University. So welcome, Professor Harris. We also have Linda Donavan Harper, Executive Director of Cultural Tourism in D.C. Welcome also to you. Do we have Gregory Aftandilian? Is Gregory here? Yes. Gregory Aftandilian is Senior Fellow for the Middle East, Center for National Policy. I think we've made our tour. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Cynthia Schneider. Cynthia Schneider is a very important member of the board of ICD, has been around almost since we began. Actually, one of our first conferences at Columbia University way back when was where we first met. Since then, Cynthia has been really very, very helpful in the development of ICD, both content-wise and strategically. She's spoken in Berlin and Washington and beyond. Cynthia Schneider is in many ways a great example of a cultural diplomat. In her heart, she was actually, for most of her life, a tenured professor of art history at Georgetown University when she got called by a friend of hers to go into active duty when Bill Clinton asked her to be his ambassador to the Netherlands. And that was, I think, one of the first times where Ambassador Schneider really got the chance to practice cultural diplomacy as an ambassador. Since then, she's been convinced and converted, and I think has been really I always say she's the hardest working woman in cultural diplomacy in the U.S. She's been teaching cultural diplomacy at Georgetown, but also practicing it really around the world, recently in Egypt, amongst other places. So I'm really happy that you could be here, and I could think of no one more perfect to chair the panel discussion for today. The title of the panel discussion I will read, it's up here on the board: The Use of Innovative Concepts of Intercultural Dialogue to Build Friendships and Foster Trust Between Civil Society Groups from the USA and the Islamic World. So if you could please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Ambassador Schneider and the entire panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mark. I must say I'm profoundly unimpressed with the influence I've had at ICD. One of my suggestions has been to have slightly smaller panels, so obviously you are not in the presence of someone who carries any influence. And I am really going to ask all of you to forgive me if I don't get everyone exactly right. But everyone settle in. I've asked each of the panelists to give an address of about 1 hour apiece. So I actually was once on a panel that even bigger than this, and that, I'm not kidding, the moderator began with an hour-long address, and it went downhill from there. So that is not going to happen here, and I am trying to think of the best way to use the talents of this panel. And I think what I'm going to do is throw out a couple of provocative questions, building a little bit on my colleague, Professor Lieber's fantastic presentation, and see what comes out of it, and then we'll go from there, and I'll make sure I have some sense of some of your expertise, but not everyone. So everyone will get a chance to speak in a question-answer way, and then we're going to turn to you, because this is really, as the last session of the day, this is your chance to it's our chance to engage with all of you. And so if there's something someone has said that you feel strongly about, and of course they're gone, we'll answer on their behalf. There was a little bit of a discussion of the question of the American empire in the last session. I had a similar experience to Professor Lieber's. I remember being at a panel discussion or seminar for several days at Salzburg in around 2003, 2004, and full of Europeans, and they were all jumping all over me for the American empire, and I just said, "What are you talking about? We have no empire. What are you talking about?" And within a month of my return to the U.S., there must have been 10 books published on the American empire. So they were on to something, whether or not it's true. So I think I want to ask this panel, with their different expertise, is a little bit about that concept of what is really the nature of America's power in the world today? There is a lot of, and how does it relate to civil society as an important actor? And for some of you, that might mean cultural groups. For some of that might mean civil rights groups. It might mean development organizations, or political organizations. Please speak from your own expertise. We hear a lot of talk about the age of 24/7 communication, empowerment, the people's voice, all the revolutions and all of that, and yet, if you look at the way international relations are practiced, it's profoundly unimaginative and profoundly still business as usual, government to government. And they'll talk about how important all these other things are, but they don't really integrate, that I can see, into actually what's going on in international relations. So I'm curious how each of you sees power in general, American power specifically, and I would like you to talk about soft power as well, which depends on America's power as an example. So it depends on a certain amount of moral authority in order to have that soft power. So how do civil society groups play into that, and how important is this business with which we were very occupied in the immediate post 9/11 years of building trust, building communications? Is that still such a focus? Is it still important, or do we move on to a different kind of agenda, having accomplished that, or have we not accomplished it at all? Mark, maybe I'll start with you. How about in the area of human, and then everyone else can be thinking. I'll just pick on my friends to start, because at least I know your name. In the area of human rights, how do you see power breaking down? How effective are civil society groups? Where are they making a difference, and what is the interaction with their counterparts in the U.S.?
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador. It's a thrill to be here. For those of you that don't know the story, I actually met Ambassador Schneider when I was a Fulbright.
Call me Cynthia. It's all right.
Cynthia. I met Ambassador Cynthia Schneider when I was a Fulbright Scholar in Holland. I was there. I was for my first week, our Fulbright orientation, and I was very excited about making a great first impression. And we had a coffee break, and of course I spent my coffee breaks talking with all the other Fulbright Scholars that were in the room, because everyone's incredibly interesting. And they said, well, gee, we're going to start up for a return back to the session soon. I said, gee, I have to go use the restroom. I ran out of the room, did my business, and I ran back to the room. And I didn't want to be too late, because I didn't want to have a bad first impression. And as I ran out of the men's room, Cynthia was walking out of the women's room. And I was not looking down. I was looking straight ahead. I'm a little taller than average. I smacked right into her and plowed her down. And I picked her off the ground and said, I'm terribly sorry. Are you okay? And she looked at me and she said, who are you? And I said, I'm Mark Vlasic. Who are you? She said, I'm Cynthia. I'm the ambassador. And that was my first impression. So we obviously got along very well after that. She put me on her delegation to the Pan Am Lockerbie trial, which was just a phenomenal experience. And since then, my life has actually been a direct result of this kind of different trajectory, because I was meant to be focusing on international trade, as my Fulbright scholarship had said. And instead, I wound up doing public international law and working at the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague and working on the Srebrenica genocide case and Slobodan Milosevic case. And since then, I've had a much stronger kind of connection to international law and human rights. And one of the things I think is fascinating about those particular areas is how much impact individuals and small groups of individuals, particularly nonprofit groups and others, can actually make in that field. Because unlike domestic law, which in the States I think is very strongly grounded, in the world of international law and human rights, it's relatively new. I mean, it's really since Nuremberg that we had this wacky concept that we're going to try kind of these senior generals and kind of senior officials for war crimes. And after the arrest of Slobodan Milosevic, we had the arrest of Saddam Hussein and Charles Taylor, and one after the other, people are starting to fall. And in addition to those senior leaders who've been arrested and then tried for their crimes, you've now had senior officials being followed for the money they've stolen. And a large part of that is because of civil society. You know, when those of us on the panel were at university, we only knew a world where if you're a terrible dictator, you either died in office, died in a coup, or died living in some villa we're living off the money you stole from your people. And what I think is fascinating is the fact that within the scope of the 10 years or so I've been a lawyer, we now know a world where if you're a terrible dictator, you usually are at least indicted for the crimes you perpetrated, and the money you've stolen, those people in those countries, whether it be Libya or Iraq or elsewhere, are saying, well, what about the money? We should get that money back. And I think what drives that is the fact that people feel a cause beyond themselves and a cause to say this is not right and this is not just and we should go after that. And I think that aspect of civil society is incredibly important, particularly when you look at the Arab Spring.
Thank you, Mark. That is a great start. That's a great start and actually very inspiring to think of the role of individuals. Does anyone have a response that's related to what Mark said? Or yes. And would you mind introducing yourself again?
Tom Palmer from the Atlas Network in Cato. And
Thank you.
I think that's actually, I'll just take issue very strongly. All the examples you gave were arrested because of military power. So I don't see the civil society there. I think those were examples of imperial extensions of power. Saddam Hussein wasn't overthrown by Iraqi civil society or by the Red Cross. So that seems a very puzzling inference to make. Civil society has a very important role to play, but when the U.S. extends its nation-building exercises, I think it's substantially counterproductive. We see the failures in one case after another. I apologize, I'm overcoming a lung infection, so a little halting. Afghanistan, which I visit quite frequently, is a failure from the perspective of American foreign policy. The idea that they're going to turn it into Oregon in a short period of time reflected the most gross arrogance on the part of American and NATO policymakers who did not understand the society. No state has ever done what our government insists they will be able to do, which is extend the sovereign power of the state from one internationally recognized border to another. Alexander the Great didn't do it, the Mughals didn't do it, the Soviets didn't do it, and we're not going to do it either. So I think civil society is what we should be talking about, but all the examples we gave were actually taxpayer money and weapons, not civil society.
You would, I'm sorry, really quick. You think that applies to Milosevic? You think that applies to Gaddafi?
I think the invasion of Serbia by the United States had some role to play. There was also civil society. Oh, please, please, bombing the country as we did, blowing up the Chinese embassy, which was a little mistake. Sorry.
Well, that doesn't have to do with Milosevic's indictment in any case.
There was a movement within Serbia, to be true, to be sure. But these cases of extension of power really need to be distinguished very clearly from those, so we don't fool ourselves, and we can have a more serious discussion that sending cruise missiles to blow up buildings is not an extension of civil society. And not that I'm critical of civil society, I want it, but I want to be clear what we're talking about, and these are different principles.
Would you like to clarify?
So I think we
say some of those
completely
things.
disagree in the sense that I think that the movement that brought down Milosevic was not a handful of cruise missiles that went to the MOOC building and to the Chinese embassy and a couple of other buildings. I think dictatorships and governments are loath to release power, and just a couple of buildings blow up is not the reason why they give up power. I think in the case of Milosevic, if you look at Peter Ackerman's kind of Center for International Nonviolent Conflict, those are the type of organizations that help bring networks together to help bring down these dictators, and the whole focus is on the nonviolent way.
I know this is the only case that's plausible. Libya, you also mentioned, wasn't about Libyan civil society.
Well, I think you're moving in a number of other directions, which are very interesting, and we could have a whole panel on Afghanistan, but that isn't exactly what we're doing. I just will add one comment of that. Certainly, in the case of Charles Taylor, that was indeed a civil society movement that eventually brought the warlords together and stopped that war, and eventually led to, made it possible for him to be captured and indicted. And, there's a film about that. The person who led it won the Nobel Prize, and she is definitely a member of civil society. Why don't we maybe go on to some other subjects? Did you have a related comment, or else I was going to go to development, and if you wanted to talk about civil society related to development.
Well, I don't have much to say about civil society, but one point which was...
Doesn't seem to matter much.
One point which is, I want to step back because this was a comment which was made about hard power and soft power. As an economist, we are taught early on something called budget constraint, okay? And given the budget constraint, if one goes up, usually the other goes down. And in the case of the United States of America, as we can see that over the years, the defense-related expenditures have gone up tremendously. Now, according to one estimate, it's more than $1 trillion, okay? You can look at it, somebody with 700,000 or something like that. But on the other hand, if you look at foreign aid budgets, it has been standing still, okay? And if you want to convince people, okay, well, if one goes up, then the other cannot go up. Other has to go down, okay? And so with hard power, you can convince people temporarily, but you cannot win hearts, okay? And for that, you need soft power. So for that, you need a lot more budget than what's provided is now provided in the United States of America at the current moment, okay? And also, globalization has cut into this thing. I remember that when I was growing up in Bangladesh, at that time I used to go to the USIS Information Agency to read things, learn things. Those are valuable experience. But nowadays, when the children are growing up, they don't go to the USIS center. They read it from the computers at home.
Well, that's because there is no USIS center.
Okay, well,
that
whatever.
would be the main
Equivalent is
reason.
this. Okay, because of budget constraint and other things. That exactly proves my point.
Yeah.
Okay, that serious budget constraints are there. Okay, so if one goes up, the another thing goes up, and there is serious competition worldwide. Okay, the Chinese are coming. China now provides more foreign aid than the World Bank, which may not be known to people.
Interesting.
Okay. And also they provide softer foreign aid without what you call conditionalities. Because if many of these international organizations go there, they say that you have to do this, you have to do that. Okay, Chinese say that we don't want to get into your what you call governance structure and so on. One of the reasons Millennium Challenge account has not been particularly successful because the way it has been structured, that to qualify for that thing, you have to do what you call a governance thing. But the thing is that you are basically emphasizing the processes, inputs, not the final outcomes. Because like some countries may not be particularly good in terms of governance. Look at Asian countries. Most of the Asian countries will come at the bottom. The fastest growing countries are come at the bottom of the World Bank governance criteria. But they are the fastest growing country, India, China, everybody. So what you should do, your reward should be based on your outcome, whether these countries are doing well in terms of their outcomes or rather than whether they are doing well in terms of governance. So my basic point is that there is an inverse relationship between soft power and hard power.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense, and a lot of people would agree with that. I just have to invoke Afghanistan again a little bit in response to a couple of your points, just with a couple of horrifying statistics. One, I believe it costs about $1 million per year per soldier in Afghanistan. But I'm afraid I don't think, honestly, the story of aid in Afghanistan is any better. If you talk to most, official U.S. aid, or any other country aid, if you talk to anyone who's been to Afghanistan, had been there for a very, very long period of time, I will quote Nancy Dupree, who's this legendary American woman who's lived there for 40 years, and she will say that the greatest danger to Afghanistan now, something she's never seen before in all of her years there, is corruption, which has come through the foreign aid, which inexplicably we delivered in boatloads of cash to warlords in the initial years there, which is so hard to understand. But anyway, that flow has continued, and so now we're going to leave, but we will leave behind that indelible mark of a totally corrupt and a system that doesn't operate, unfortunately, you know, from both of those things, both spending. So it's kind of hard to know where you win.
Well,
I'm going to let some other people speak. I'm just going to have the last word on that one and let you answer later.
Okay,
That's my privilege. So you go ahead.
Yeah, it's Greg Aftandilian. We talk about American power. I think it's important to also talk about the strength of American diversity, and that diversity has actually helped U.S. foreign policy over various decades. The example of World War II, where U.S. Army intelligence recruited thousands and thousands of ethnic Americans to work for the war effort, and many of them were parachuted behind enemy lines because they were able to speak the languages of their parents, and so those things have always helped. There's an interesting side to this too, is that I come from the Armenian American community. That's my ethnic background, and right now in Syria, of course, you have this ongoing, very bloody civil war. The international community is basically, for the most part, taking a hands-off approach while people are dying. But what's interesting about civic society in this case is that the Armenian American community is actually raising funds here to send to their ethnic brethren in Syria, getting around governments to make sure it actually gets to the people who actually need the money, who are very much in dire straits because of the violence that is taking place there. So I want to make those two particular points.
Thank you. That is an excellent point. Did you want to
Sure.
add something, Juliette, about the media side? Or
Yeah,
maybe
no.
that's not your area so much.
It is, in fact.
Okay, good. And
But,
Juliette and I just have to, good. But feel free to talk about military spending.
First of all, Search for Common Ground is a conflict transformation organization, so I won't talk about military spending. But I first of all wanted to commend the young woman who asked the question about the empire and started all this fuss in the first place. And I made a similar error back in grad school. I'm originally Canadian and did this in Leon First class, who at the time was advising Al Gore in his presidential campaign, and received a similar reaction. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the U.S. power being in owning the narrative, in owning the way that we talk about relationships with others. And that's one area that Search for Common Ground has focused immensely, especially when it comes to relationships with Muslim majority countries around the world, as well as the Muslim community domestically in the United States. And we have, first of all, the Common Ground news service, which some of you may be aware of. It's a free news service. You can find it online. And it's, first of all, we're reaching out to people in all sorts of different countries, as well as here in local languages and speaking across local languages. So trying to shift this idea that media is a monologue, that it's a way of speaking at people, but instead looking at media as a way of fostering dialogue. And as a part of that, we've also created a terminology document looking at the way most international media is talking about topics related to Islam and Muslims. And this is something that still persists, even though, I mean, we are now 11 years after 9/11, and I mean, people have been working in this field for decades. But looking at words which are misused or misunderstood or understood very differently in different contexts, such as empire, for example, and how
Crusaders.
yes, and how we can change, in slight changes in the way we talk about things, we can actually impact the relationship, and that's a crucial point of cultural dialogue.
Excellent point. Yes, please. Linda, from the Cultural Tourism, and I'm sure you are building dialogue all the time in DC.
Yes, and not in the military, so I won't talk about that either. But I do want to, there's just been a couple of things, two different areas that I wanted to sort of follow up on in terms of sort of the media and that side. Washington, D.C. gets 18 million visitors a year. That's this year we got that, but that's the first time in 11 years that we are back to 18 million visitors. That 11 years goes back to 9/11, and part of that is perception, part of that is dialogue, part of that is media. It's a wide variety of things, and how you go about creating sort of that brand and telling that story, I think, is really interesting. I had a conversation earlier in the day about sort of country branding or city branding and what role that plays in how we talk about who lives in our country, who works in our country, how we greet people, how we create power in sort of a very soft way, but in a very interesting way. And Recently, the president created a new sort of dialogue around tourism to create something called Brand USA, which is now really struggling to figure. It's a public-private partnership because we are starting to see tourism on the rise, and cultural tourism in particular. And of the 4 points of the new Brand USA, cultural tourism plays a role in 3 of those. But it's ironic, and as we're trying to put it together, what is that picture and what is the diversity of a country like the United States? And I'm sure that's true of countries around the world as they try to tell their story in an authentic way. There's nothing worse than inviting someone to your city, to your country, and you tell them, you know, we're the jazz capital or we're some other entity, only to get there and find, well, oh, we're the jazz capital, but oh gee, we have 3 jazz clubs. You know, it's you have to be authentic in this story. But when the story is diverse, as it is in the United States, I think it's hard to do that. And I will give you an odd example of that, in that we got very excited recently in the tourism industry because there was huge growth in passports in Brazil and China, which meant there were going to be huge new numbers of people coming from those countries. But when you really start to look at where they are going and what they are seeing, it's a very sad story. The bulk of the Brazilian passports are coming to Miami, and their location is Disney World. They're coming they're landing in Miami, they're going to Orlando, and basically what they want to see is Disney World. The same is true of the Chinese tourist who's basically landing on the West Coast, a great deal of it going to LA, which gets certainly one perspective of the United States, but certainly not a full perspective. So I think we have to be very careful as we think about how we're projecting soft power, the perception and the image of what we put out there and how we put it out there, whether it's through the media, whether it's through dialogue, or whether we think we're going at it in a very non-adverse way, only to find that we're creating perceptions we can't then authenticate when the person gets here or when the story gets here. So it's about storytelling, and I think that's important. So.
Well, you certainly, I mean, you have very important job. Actually, I'm sure we've all heard so many stories from visitors who come to Washington, D.C. from other countries, and it's something we all take for granted, but just even touring the monuments of Washington, D.C. can be a very profound experience. I remember talking to Dutch friends after they had been here, and they were so, one story I used actually in a very important speech in Holland, because I was so impressed by it, that a friend told me that she went around the monuments in Washington with her children who were like 10 and 12. And the end of that day, she asked them what the United States stood for. They hadn't actually had American history in school or anything like that. And they gave a wonderful, complete answer, just based on going to those monuments and seeing what they said. And then she said, well, so what does Holland stand for? And they couldn't say, you know, they couldn't, and I mean, I could say, you could say, I mean, Holland stands for a lot of very good things and very similar values, but they don't actually put it out there. There are no equivalent monuments in that whole country to one of ours. So it's a very interesting thing, these monuments that we have, but you of course have to get people to them. And something very positive, I think, that the State Department has started doing, and it's very good news that this ridiculous Smith-Mundt Act was finally repealed, and we don't need to go into that, but it allows more focus from the United States, also State Department actually, on things in the United States. So they've started to do more of bringing foreign groups here and foreign people here. A fair amount of funding goes to that, and I think it's such an important part of what they do, just every bit as important as all the Americans in other places.
Well, and I think to sort of back that up, the protocol office at State now does what they're calling the American experience, and 3 or 4 times a year literally take the ambassadors together around the country. They've been to Alaska, they've been to Arkansas. That gets you to see different parts of our United States. But they go as a group in the dialogue, 40 ambassadors on a trip, seeing a different
Fantastic.
part of the United States, creates a very different dynamic, and I would love to be a fly on the wall on that, to actually hear the dialogue that goes on among the ambassadors in those. The trip to Arkansas had a very strategic component about segregation in it, and that history. So they're not mincing words about it, but it's not only in terms of bringing people in, but I think trying to really figure out what that American experience is critical.
That is really very interesting.
Could I ask people, we discussed Islam, which is the topic of the panel. I'd like to emphasize a very important point that was made a moment ago about language. Especially Americans often don't think carefully about the words they use. Crusade was mentioned, obvious mistake. The Crusader tank is perceived as an invading weapon. But there are other terms, such as secular, has a very different meaning to Americans and in the Muslim world because of the influence of the extreme laicite of Kemalism in Turkey, which does not mean freedom of religion, it means freedom from religion, state control of religion, which is not what any religious person would welcome. And so when I work in Muslim countries and I talk with my colleagues, I emphasize freedom of religion, the freedom to practice one's religion, not secularism, which they hear as state domination through a ministry of religion that writes the sermons. It means being careful about being respectful of other people's traditions, which sometimes Americans should emphasize, to be more willing to understand you're in another person's house. And finally, and I find two forms of this, lecturing other people on the meaning of their religion is offensive. And it comes in two forms. The well-meaning, nice person who wants to get along, who explains Islam means peace and explains this to Muslims. This is arrogant and offensive. And then those like Robert Spencer who say Islam means war and violence and is inherently uncivilized. There's a discussion among Muslims about what their religion means. Does it mean peace and equal rights, or does it mean domination by one over the other? That debate happened among Jews, among Christians, and other groups as well. And it will play out. But when non-Muslims lecture Muslims on what their religion means, it is always badly received. And I have learned to be respectful and quiet. I work with Muslim liberals. They are my friends, and I respect them. But I don't express opinions about their religion as such. And finally, the last thing you hear all the time, the Muslims need a reformation. This reflects a Protestant perspective on what the Reformation means. Catholics don't see it quite the same way. And second, the Reformation was accompanied with wars of religion that depopulated large parts of Europe. We should not forget that. Let's hope Muslims don't experience the Reformation like that. And third, it reflects a misunderstanding of Islam totally, because Islam isn't organized like a church of the Roman Catholic sort. There's no pope. There's no hierarchy. In a sense, it's like congregationalism already in the Christian world. So it's unwise for people to import concepts to a dialogue that they don't understand. And I recommend reading, and one very good book, and I'll be quiet, that I think is outstanding, Mustafa Akyol's book, Islam Without Extremes. He did not like the title. It's a Muslim case for liberty within Islam that recognizes the debates internal to the religion. But it is very good reading, and for someone who wants to see Islam from within in a different liberal perspective, I strongly recommend this book.
Did you have a comment, Professor?
Yes, thank you. Daryl Harris from Howard University. A number of things came to my mind. When I first came in, there was the exchange about some of the history and experience. And then some of these comments got me thinking about, I know in the African American community, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is it depends on who's asking the question or who's speaking. Or another way of saying it is, whose reality is this anyway? Meaning there are different vantage points that different groups are viewing the same reality, or presumably the same reality. I'm sort of jumping around here because the religion comment also got me. One of the interests that I have is African traditional religion. I study Ifa, which is the religion of the Yoruba people. And we all know that the dominant Western religions, including Islam, Christianity, especially, the Western world views African religion as negative. We see it all through the media. And this includes, by the way, black Christians. So I grew up in a Church of God in Christ. My grandfather is a pastor, my uncles. And so just me studying outside of that context, I don't talk to my family about it anymore because they say I'm going to go to hell and all of that. And just one more comment on that. There was a major conference held in Nigeria, Yoruba land, of practitioners of the ancient religion. And even in Nigeria, you have Christian Nigerians, Muslim Nigerians who were condemning the conference. And I found that quite troubling. And so I guess for me, I'm thinking about the challenge of mutual respect, mutual acceptance of groups, of peoples. And for me, culture is at the heart of it. If we can't embrace people's traditions, if it's always an imposition, whether it's coming hard or soft, we're not making progress. And I think also I was listening to the exchange, and it struck me because we had two different vantage points, and one of the vantage points wants to say forget. I was watching this program on PBS the other night, just flipping the channels. It was called The Abolitionists. I don't know if anyone saw it, but they were giving snippets of some of the prominent abolitionists during the antebellum period, and some of the harshness of the treatment of the enslaved African people, the kind of punishments that were visited on people. A lot of us don't know any of this history. We want to sweep it under the rug. So how are we going to move ourselves forward if this 250 years of this experience is forgotten? And the people who live, the descendants of those people today who continue to experience various forms of exclusion, discrimination, are told, you have a black president now, we're in a post-racial period, forget it. So I know, and I know it's the same with embracing and understanding the Islamic world, with immigrants who are here, who are coming in and experience various forms of exclusion and discrimination. I know we have a long way to go, because if we can't sit at the same table and respect the different peoples who are at the table and the traditions that they bring, we still have a long way to go. So.
No, you make a really excellent points, and just to bring it back to the topic of the panel again, of course, one of the least understood and I think recognized, I mean, people just aren't aware, is, of course, the large numbers of African-American Muslims in this country. It's the largest proportion of the American Muslim population, and somehow it just seems to escape people's consciousness. And you raise a very important issue of culture and remembrance, and how a country comes to grips with its own history, and it's very often through culture, either through contemporary cultural manifestations or through a really serious study of its history. And I'm about to go to Cambodia to look into this very same issue, and you just remind me that we haven't really done it here, which is a very sobering thought. I think we can look in some respects to the example of ICD's home country of Germany, which I think is really, at least in the 20th century, a real example of a country that has really looked at its past and tried to face it in every way and understand it rather than just move past it. Maybe I'll just turn to you, Juliette, quickly before we turn to questions from the audience, and ask you to talk a little bit about some of the media work that Search for Common Ground has done, because I think it's done fantastic work that brings people together. We all know that people-to-people contact is the best, but it's just impractical on a large scale, and so I personally work in and think about the impact that media has, including use of language and characterization of people. I have a nonprofit in Los Angeles that works with television and film writers and producers and showrunners, trying to give them information about things having to do with Muslim and Islam, with the hopes that they'll have more accurate and authentic characters and plots. You know, our television and film are for-profit industries. They're not the UN, so they listen or they don't, but we try to make it possible for them to have richer and more authentic characters, because I think those negative stereotypes perpetuated through media can have a devastating effect. You, on the other hand, do very good work in media. Maybe you can describe some of that.
Sure. I actually read this beautiful quote this morning when I was thinking about preparing for the panel today by Adrienne Rich, and she's a poet. And she said one of the great functions of art is to help us imagine what it's like to be not ourselves. And so I think a lot of the work that we do through the media is really to see if there are ways where we can ask people or inspire people to think about things in a different way. And so there's a number of ways that Search for Common Ground does that. We work with musicians. We had a lovely compilation done with Melissa Etheridge. Do folks know who that is? Okay, I'm starting to feel old, and that my cultural references don't always go over. And Salman Ahmed, who I didn't know who was. I was actually editing one of his articles, and I got to the byline, and it said Sufi rocker, and I'm like, yeah, right. I can't put someone's byline as a Sufi rocker, and I looked him up, and he actually is a Sufi rocker. He's the original Sufi rocker. Yeah. He's a huge Pakistani rock star. So having them come together to produce a music video, you know, and it's called Ring the Bells, incidentally, if you want to look it up. It's on YouTube. And we do
beautiful song, really beautiful song.
Yeah, and we do some work with television and radio soap operas. So we use the medium of fiction, looking at conflicts within and between groups, and having sort of a running narrative where folks are looking at the real conflicts that exist and the real differences that exist. So not ignoring those obvious pieces, but then looking at ways that they can, you know, in their day-to-day lives, approach conflict in a different way. So that's one of the ways, and these stories are generally around the idea of a team. So it's generally a soccer team. And occasionally we do cricket, depending on the countries that we're working in. And it's really, so it's a diverse team that comes together, and they have a goal of winning a tournament. I mean, it's sort of like this idea of Glee, where they want to win the music competition, and yet everybody's coming at it from a different angle. So what needs to happen in that group, what dynamics need to happen for them to win? And so we also work with groups in pure media, so nonfiction writing, hopefully, and we do that. We train journalists around the world. We train journalists in the United States, and we sit down and talk about how do we report, what do we think about, do we understand what we're reporting, and to be a journalist in this day and age with social media and needing to be an expert in everything, I don't envy them the jobs. And people are really keen to come in and think about how do we look at it, how do we put ourselves in the other's shoes, and how do we just not preach to the people who already agree with us? Because I know I read the first sentence in an article and I decide if I'm going to finish it or not. So how in that first sentence do we attract those people who we actually want to influence and reach out to? So the idea is really that if you were in the room with these people, after reading your article, they'd want to sit down at the table and have a conversation with you. So it's shifting that paradigm just slightly. We've had really enormous successes. We've had people who have written in and said, I'd love to talk to that pastor in the United States, who, Pastor Lavender, who said after the Quran burning that I'm going to send a copy of the Quran to a church for every copy of the Quran that's burnt. And we had people in Lebanon reaching out and saying, wow, look at this example. I had no idea that there were American Christians who were like this. And we've received articles from people in Yemen who have said, I've looked at Muslim Western understanding from a conservative perspective, but after reading these articles, I'm starting to think about it in a different way. So there really is a way that you can impact people on a human level through stories and through narratives, be they fiction or nonfiction.
Thank you so much. I think if no one here has something more they'd like to add, we're happy to take any questions from the audience.
Okay, so questions or comments, there's many.
I think it's much. I haven't been here all day, but it'd be nice to get people who haven't
of course
asked questions
We'll
first.
start here, and then we go to some new voices.
And then we'll get,
Hi. Well, my name is Catalina Garcia. And first, I actually want to thank the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for putting pretty much all their material online, because in Mexico, training in cultural diplomacy is limited to the diplomatic elite. So basically, all my education in the subject has been through the website of the Institute. But I come from a different, background, and the way in which I want to approach the matter of establishing, using cultural diplomacy through civil society is more from a Latin American perspective, which has been really interesting because Latin America has been not that present in the conference, and it's concerning from my point of view. But I'll tell you a little bit about just recently, just a couple of months ago, the peace movement in Mexico, which is a huge movement, articulated a bus caravan or bus tour in the United States. And
sorry, did what in the United States?
A bus tour. So they're nonviolent protests. These are articulated around bus tours in Mexico, and only recently it extended the strategy to the United States as raising awareness that it's not just an issue in Mexico, and also that it's a conflict going on in Mexico. It's not a security issue, but it's actually like a war that needs to be addressed with policy about like displaced populations and all this stuff that no one wants to talk about. But my question, a bit more abstract terms, is civil society in countries like mine are usually the groups that are telling a counter narrative of like our national reality, and are trying to influence or like affect social change by telling a different story, right? And when they seek to connect with other countries, they usually will seek for groups that are willing to receive this different story. So what would you say are the challenges of actually allowing, these connections from the state perspective, because you're allowing people that have, a completely different narrative than the official narrative, to make those connections, and what are the challenges that civil society face when actually trying to engage in this way? So, thank you.
Do you want me to collect a few and then we give it back to the panel? Yeah?
Well, maybe just two or so.
Yeah, okay.
Really
I think there are some new
question.
voices.
Sorry, I know I'm not a new voice, so I appreciate it. My name is Jessica Henry de Mariona, and I have two questions. One was directed at the gentleman who's with the Armenian descent, yes. Secretary Clinton mentioned in one of her speeches that immigrants in the U.S. are the singular biggest providers of foreign aid to their native countries in the form of remittances. And I think what she didn't necessarily mention was the exportation of culture of the U.S., positive and negative, that gets exported back with that money. And having lived in Latin America and being able to see how civil society has skipped over corrupt governments in order to provide aid in their home countries, where would you see the future of that going? Because one of the biggest problems is in giving money to corrupt governments, and there is a lot of corruption also in Latin America, where a lot of American money and aid money is going. So how would you say Americans could further that? And then my other question was just for Ms. El-Ali. I used some telenovelas or soap operas produced by Pasmo, which is a part of PSI, called Sexto Sentido, made in Nicaragua, basically to prevent AIDS prevention and gender development. And that was a form of culture being used to promote sort of social issues. And where do you see the future of that? I mean, obviously PSI is working in that. Do you see that elsewhere? Thank you.
Why don't we just go with those questions, Mark, because they're fairly complex and I don't want to lose track of them. So the challenges for people operating in civil society who are presenting a counter-narrative often to the dominant narrative. I mean, we know, for example, in Egypt, the challenges are you get arrested and put in jail, and if you're American, you're taken out, and if you're Egyptian, you're still on trial. But we of course like to think that in the United States, that is the counter narrative is welcome and it's open. People are open to it. But I'd love to hear from some of the experiences of people on the panel if they have comments in response to that. Obviously, the channels are not as direct and straightforward as they are for government to government channels, and the power lies in different arenas. I know Mexico has such an incredibly rich cultural life, and artists and cultural figures are so involved in politics. That's somewhat less true here. So sometimes because of those actual cultural differences, you look for your counterpart in another country, and your counterpart in another country isn't doing actually what you're doing. And so then it's hard to make those connections. I don't know if anyone has any experiences to share or further thoughts on that subject.
I'll jump in. Okay, go ahead. So I've worked kind of on both sides of the issue. I spent a number of years working in the government, the United States government. I'm an officer, and also I spent time working at the World Bank. And when I worked at the White House and the Pentagon and the World Bank, there are strong civil society groups that are not a big fan of the U.S. government, the Pentagon, or the World Bank. And I can say, being an insider in those organizations and listening to groups oftentimes be very critical of what we're doing, and my view is they play a very important role. I may not agree with everything they say, and I think oftentimes where you stand depends on where you sit. And because I was in government or at the World Bank, I sat in a particular world where I had a particular worldview, but it was helpful to have that influence push on us to do something. And I think you can see an example of that with Transparency International. It is a worldwide group that's is out there fighting corruption. Very much, a organization at the local level, very much a grassroots organization throughout the world, but it gets together every year for this big conference. And one area where I saw them being incredibly helpful to the process of something I was working at the World Bank, which was helping developing countries track down and recover stolen assets from past dictators or grand corruption cases, was the fact that the TI and a group called Sherpa in France, two civil society groups, was very instrumental in helping basically shame the French government into going after the assets of African dictators. And there's a big case of Equatorial Guinea, where the son of the dictator runs the place now. The French government decided to pursue a case, in large part because these civil society groups were pushing them to do it. And frankly, I think one of the reasons why the U.S. government has been pursuing the assets of the same dictator's son, and particularly his $32 million mansion in Malibu and a G5 Gulfstream jet and the famous Michael Jackson glove, is because of the pressure being put on the U.S. government saying, well, what are you guys doing on this? And so I think there are a number of examples out there where civil society groups throughout the world are learning from each other. And you can look at, as this one particular case of TI France, looking to how it influences other Transparency International chapters around the world and how it helps spawn a greater grass movement to push for change for good.
Interesting. And
Let me just answer that.
and then please answer that, and then if you wouldn't mind moving on to the question about the immigrants.
Well, that's what I was going to
Oh, good, okay. The export of culture with the remittances, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of diasporan groups give money to either their home country from either a generation ago or several generations ago, and a lot of that is done with very altruistic purposes. The key challenge is to funnel that money through honest NGOs or organizations that will use the money wisely and will be transparent in how they say, they've gotten X amount of money and this is where the money has been spent, and you can track that. For example, in the Armenian diasporan case, there's an American University of Armenia in Armenia, and Syrian Armenian students are now trying to go there, and the community is raising money for their tuition. So, but people have had a good reputation in terms of viewing that university as being non-corrupt and a place where you can actually send money to and it's not going to go into somebody's pocket. So, I mean, I think it's incumbent upon people who are giving, the people in diaspora organizations from whatever culture, to to actually be very careful about which particular organizations they're sending the money to. And if it's, if organizations are not transparent, then I think people should really have a second thought about, giving that type of assistance. I hope that answers your question.
She asked about, with the remittances, do you feel that American culture is also exported?
You mean by people in America sending, in other words, the feedback you get? Yeah. I think that is very, very important. I mean, if the fact that this is coming from the United States, I think bolsters the image. I mean, if assistance is coming from the United States, that does wonders, I think, for the American image. And I think too often, and not to just leaving aside the remittances and the assistance level, but too often I think our foreign aid goes down the consultancy path, and it goes into a kind of a black hole where people don't know where the money's actually sent. I was working at the State Department in the 90s, and I got to go to Egypt. And one of the most heartening things I remember was I went into some village, and the people had a water purification plant, and they knew it was funded by America. And so they were, they put me at the head table, and started praising America. And it was just so heartening to see something like that, because so often foreign assistance, as I said, goes down this consultancy path where people take X amount out or this and that, and by the time it actually gets to somebody in need, it's filtered down to a point of negligence. So I just offer that as an editorial comment.
Yeah, no, that can be true. Did that get all of those questions? Yeah. Oh, no, you were going to ask about the subtelenovelas, and then you.
Yeah, and my predecessor, Lena Ali, couldn't make it. She asked me to come today in her stead. My name's Juliette Schmidt, but that's a small detail. I think when it comes to civil society organizations that are producing media, I think they have to realize that they are a civil society organization. They have a mission. They have an agenda. And so I think in some ways there's not the same freedoms that, Hollywood has to create stuff like this. When I think of shows like Glee, could we do a Sue Sylvester, that's her name, right? Sue Sylvester character, and have her say those type of shocking comments? I'm not sure that a civil society organization could go that far. And in some ways, I think that's a limitation. However, I also think that they've been very successful in addressing issues as long as they ensure that they have local staff, local script writers, local consultants, all working. I'm not going to be the person to go and write our scripts for our Yemen radio program or for our Pakistani, cricket team program. But I think if they realize, if the local circumstances are taken into context when creating these things, I do believe that they can be powerful. And in some of our Africa programs, we've done HIV/AIDS stuff as well. We've had incredible results, especially in terms of getting men to talk about a real man as somebody who is not violent against women and things like that. And we have statistics that show that on certain hours of certain days, everybody shuts down and goes and huddles around the radio to listen to these things. So they are resonating with audiences, but I do think there's limitations, and we need to be aware of those as well. We can't preach at people.
Professor Quibria, did you want to?
Well, I want to say a couple of things about remittances. I come from Asia originally. And it may be true of Latin America that America is the biggest source of remittances, but in case of Asia, it's not necessarily true. Like Bangladesh, Indonesia, Philippines, the vast majority of remittances stem from Asian countries, Middle East, East Asia, and so on. And second thing is that remittances that go, that in the context of many of these countries, we have found is they're very helpful, because these are not government to government transfer. These are going from one person to another home, and so they make the best use of it. Sometimes they might be investing in house, education, and so on. But those are good investment. Those are, from our perspective, those are investments that contribute to what you call human capital development in Asia. So so cultural importation, if you are talking about, say, in Asian context, it can be many, many different cultures. It can be Japanese culture, it can be Singaporean culture, it can be Middle Eastern culture, America. As a matter of fact, from America, remittances in recent years have fallen. They haven't gone up. And in case of, I know Bangladesh data very well, is 1/10 of the total remittances, very small. So your comment is perhaps very valid in the Latin American context, but they get diluted when you talk about Asian countries, which are who are like China, India. Those have got much higher amount of remittances than the Latin American countries we are talking about. Okay.
Are there more questions? We'll make this the last round of questions, I think, then.
My name is Pierre Garlin. I come from Paris. I'd like to go back to the question of empire, because the previous speaker corrected the participant from Colombia, but he was linguistically wrong. Empire is the correct word in English, and I'd like to remind you that in 2004, an advisor to the Bush administration said to run Susskind, we're an empire now. So the word empire was rehabilitated by the right, the Bush people, but also by a host of commentators from the right, like Niall Ferguson, Harvard professor, or from the left. Chalmers Johnson, for example, has a book called Empire of Bases. And I'd like to link this with what Professor Harris said. This denial of the word empire on the part of some Americans reflects also a denial of taking into account American history within domestic political life. And I think this plays a major part in the way America is perceived outside its borders. And it undermines many public diplomacy or cultural diplomacy efforts on the part of America when Americans refuse to take into account their own quote-unquote sins or crimes and presume to teach others lessons. And we had almost an illustration of this with a speaker abruptly correcting somebody from a foreign country, although he was wrong about his own language. And also, it minimized the importance of slavery in the past, and that could carry over into calling Iraq just a mistake and not analyzing all the crimes that were committed in Iraq in the names of America. So I think many cultural projects are undermined by the attitude of some Americans, because we had a whole panel of speakers saying very different things. And this is the good thing about American conferences, diversity of opinions, and they're expressed in a polite environment. So, but some Americans who want to use cultural diplomacy in order to improve their relations with the rest of the world do not take into account their own limitations and therefore undermine their own projects. In the same way as Professor Harris mentioned, this kind of insensitivity to racial relations within the US, but it carries over to what happens with other countries. For example, the response to the Colombian participant was, in a way, rude. And I find examples of this in many official programs where culture seems to be an alibi for hard power.
Why don't we just take this? Can I just ask you one thing before the microphone goes away? Would you mind, and perhaps you did this earlier today, but I gather you do think America is an empire, has an empire. Could you tell us what your definition of empire is?
Well, first of all, I want to point out that many Americans use the term empire to describe the United States.
Right.
And empire, we had a discussion in the first session, empire versus hegemony. Empire is, there's neo-imperialism, a country that imposes what it wants on countries that do not want it. And clearly what happened in Iraq was an imperial move, not just a mistake, an imperial move.
I think you would actually, I mean, we don't need to take a vote, but I really seriously doubt you'd find people storming the barricades to defend what we did in Iraq here. I suspect you'll find a lot of agreement with what you're saying.
It's not the point. The point is what happened in Iraq was imperial.
Well, again, nobody's disagreeing with that.
Imposing what you want in countries that do not want it and hoping to derive benefits, whether political or economic, from this domination.
Right. Okay. All right. Okay, fine. Well, why don't we take the next? I'm just going to use...
and I would add that the U.S. is not the only country that has imperial design. You could argue that what China is doing in Africa is also imperial.
One could mention France as well.
France? Yeah. But I'm not a spokesman for my country. Britain and France are former empires with neo-imperial tendencies. What France is doing in Africa is neo-imperialism. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I think we'll be talking about our former ones, too, as we're bailing out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Go ahead.
Okay, my question is about civil society. My name is Jessica Karich. I'm with the State Department, and I work on human rights and labor, although I'm here just in a personal capacity. Thank you all for your thoughtful and valuable comments. I really appreciate all of the panel's insights. My question, sort of recognizing that often sustainable and legitimate reforms or changes within a country need to be organic and locally inclusive and grown sort of from the bottom up. And in that way, civil society has a very critical role to play. And I'm curious how you think, in your experience, outside stakeholders, such as U.S. government and others, might best support those civil society-driven, organic, inclusive efforts. And if, maybe a specific context, income inequality, joblessness, and promoting inclusive economic growth, and particularly in the Middle East. You can address that linkage in any context, but I suggest that one because it's sort of a hot issue at the moment. Thanks.
Do we have
time for one or two more, or should we go back to the panel?
Why don't we go to the panel? You had a question. Why don't we go to your question? Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Meryl Duran. I am the managing director for IRCNL. We co-host this event with ICD.
I am so sorry you're on my panel. I'm so sorry. I didn't even know you. You were part of the last one. I am so sorry. I thought you weren't here. I really beg your pardon.
No,
Speak,
don't worry.
ask, do whatever you would like to do.
Thank you very much. No, mine was, but it's not a real question. Is I'm very curious because I would like to have from you, very distinguished panels, some real and concrete example on which was done and which is on the plane from the civil society from USA after 9/11. Directly to the Islamic world. What is going on, actually? There is 9/11, and actually we just, after 9 years, we're actually on Arab Springs, and the movement will have to change. The feeling is changing right now, and even in Arab world and Islam world, I'm not just focusing on Arabs, but in Islam worlds, there's some expectation from U.S., and especially on civil society. And I would like to have a concrete example from you, if it's possible. And thank you very much to be there.
Okay, do you want to ask first? Answer first? Thank you for your question. I'm so sorry not to have, I'm really sorry. I didn't realize you were on the panel.
If I could then address...
Anyone else out there on this panel who I neglected? There could well be.
On the question of the Muslim world, which is very variegated and highly differentiated, it's not all Arabs are Muslims, and most Muslims are not Arabs. It's something we should remember. But I would say, connected to this question from the lady, unofficially from the State Department, most of the U.S. efforts, in my opinion, are counterproductive. We would be better off without them. They cause so much harm and corruption in that part of the world. The amount of money that sloshes through the hands of sticky fingers, if you will, is unbelievable. I have seen it with my own eyes, and it is ruining those countries, our foreign aid. Because what we do is we empower the corrupt rulers. even if you could give it to the little people, which generally it just doesn't happen. It's a fantasy. So my opinion, I'll be very strong. I would zero those budgets out. Zero. Not one penny for that.
I hope there's no one from OMB here.
I'm happy to share that. But I'll mention...
This is not the unanimous opinion of the panel.
Of course. We do a lot of work in Arabic with Arab colleagues. In Arabic and Persian, Kyrgyz, Turkish, Azerbaijani, Urdu, and Bahasa. Languages spoken every day by many hundreds of millions of people who profess the Muslim faith. People talking to each other, and I'll be very frank, we do what we can to decenter the discourse away from the United States, because our government, in my opinion, has poisoned the discussion of liberty and freedom. When liberty means a bomb is dropped on you, it turns out many people don't like it. And we tried to encourage people from Mexico to have discussions with people in Morocco and Egypt and people from Russia and China and so on. Mario Vargas Llosa's works we published in Arabic, very important voice for liberty from Peru. And to try to remove the United States from the center of that. It's one country among many, but it's not the only country that has a model of liberty to offer. Thank you for that.
Okay, that's very really interesting comment. That's wonderful that you're translating Mario Vargas Llosa. What a great idea.
Okay. Well, about foreign aid, I don't really agree with my panelists. I don't think that the world is awash with cash with the foreign aid because if you look at the data for the recent years, it hasn't gone up. Okay.
Well, I just to clarify, I think you were not saying, for example, that we spend more on aid than we do on the Pentagon. As I understood, what you were saying was what we do spend on aid, in your experience, is not always spent very wisely, doesn't get to the on the ground
diplomatic formulation.
Okay, and the second thing I want to add is that, okay, even if it's true, and I believe to a large extent it's true that many governments are corrupt, okay, and the money is not reaching where it should reach. And I also believe that civil societies in some of these countries can do an effective job of reducing poverty, bringing about inclusive growth. One of the things America can do and take a lead in that is that the World Bank still doesn't provide money to civil society organizations. Okay, America can take a lead in providing and lead in how to bring about a modality to provide funding rather than to the government, but to a large extent to the NGOs. And maybe some of the private organizations can do the reinsurance and other things, guarantees and so on in that process as well. So America can play a very good role in that process.
Okay. Yeah, so everyone, I think all three of you have comments, so go ahead.
Well, mine will be quick, because I have to get my car out of the parking garage at 7 o'clock, so I'm going to make this comment and get up and run. But sort of what America can do and what you can do. For those of you who are in the D.C. region, I would suggest that you get to know the Muslim Women's Association, who is a very vibrant organization in this area, and who has a great open door policy in terms of dialogue, lecture series. They opened the mosque at the Islamic Cultural Center on I think it's the first Saturday of May, and you can actually have that experience of going in and beginning to have a real touch and feel and sensory position there, and I would suggest that it does happen at the government level, but it also happens at the personal level. And there are great opportunities in this community, and I expect in many of your own communities, to be able to reach out and touch and have dialogue on a one-to-one perspective. And the other entity here in this community is the Indonesian embassy, is in particularly, it's one of the largest Muslim, I believe the largest
population
in the world, and they are very good about opening their doors for understanding and learning. And so while we do rely on organizations and the civil society and government, they are all made up of individuals, and so I challenge you to do it on your own. So thank you.
Just to the comment about U.S. policy towards now these political transitions in the Middle East, and particularly the Arab Spring. One of the problems we're facing is that the balance between U.S. strategic interests and U.S. support for democratic aspirations. To take the example of Egypt, when Mohamed Morsi decreed some was seen as dictatorial decrees a few months ago. This came shortly after Egypt played a helpful role with Hamas and Israel.
The next day.
Yeah, so the Obama administration toned down any criticism it might have had towards Morsi because of the strategic interests. And then, of course, the Egyptian liberals then attacked the United States for not supporting democracy. So, and with all due respect to the Bahraini ambassador to the United States, when she was giving her presentation, a lot of democratic activists in Bahrain will say the United States, because of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, is not really putting real pressure on the Bahraini government to open up. So we're always caught in this big dilemma between supporting strategic interests versus supporting democratic aspirations. And we come across as very inconsistent. And that's one of the big
hypocritical, possibly.
Yeah, and hypocritical, and that's one of the big problems for our image. Just to get to the point of the American Empire issue, I was actually helping my son, who was in junior high, study the Spanish-American War. And of course, we did have an empire as a result of the Spanish-American War, but that didn't last very long. So, I mean, it also depends on your definition of imperialism. But there was an imperial period which is taught in American schools. It's just that they say that ended in 1945 when the Philippines got its independence. But just as a clarification on that. Thanks.
Just on to your point in terms of what America's done after the Arab Spring, I'm sure our colleague from the State Department has a website somewhere that has everything that the government's done after Obama's Cairo speech. But two things I just highlight as I think the productive steps in the right direction. One is the United States has been a huge backer of this entrepreneurship summit. The first one was hosted in Turkey. The most recent one happened in Dubai a couple weeks ago, in terms of trying to find a way to encourage entrepreneurship in the Arab countries as a way of driving up employment, because obviously it's a huge concern. And then more recently, the United States, with part of its role as the presidency of the G8, helped host a summit on asset recovery in Doha, trying to recognize the fact that for those countries that have lost political leaders because of the Arab uprisings, a lot of that money and billions of dollars is sloshing around the world, and there's a way of uniting to recognize this as a global problem that requires a global solution. And so we've been very proactive in that respect as well.
I maybe will take the privilege and just try to wrap this up a little bit and say, if people, Darnell, I totally see you. So I will look for guidance, Mark, if we're going to take that or allow for conversation. I want to answer some of these things. I feel the panel's leaving. It's kind of late. And so I would encourage people to come up and talk with the panelists who can stay afterwards. I just want to recommend to people an article that brings together a number of these issues that we've been talking about by Nancy O'Kail, who was the O-K-A-I-L, who was the head of Freedom House in Egypt, and was one of the people put on trial. She's the person who famously read Orwell in the Cage when she was being brought into the Egyptian court. She's now seeking refugee status in this country. And she came out with an article on CNN that was published, I think, yesterday, in which she and a Freedom House colleague urged that the United States cut but not eliminate its aid and to Egypt, and specifically into other Arab Spring countries. And certainly my own experience in being there, and I totally agree with you on the money waste in Afghanistan. And astonishingly enough, the big lesson learned, I hear from people who know Afghanistan better than me and spend a lot of time talking to the people working on it, the big lesson learned is that we should have asked the Afghans in the beginning what they felt they needed and wanted. You know, that it takes 10 years to figure that out is a breathtaking revelation, but well, hopefully it'll go better the next time. But I think all of these issues are actually related, and they're related in a way to hard power as much as soft power, because I think what role the United States plays in the world and what image and presence it projects, now people really don't cut us a break for regional interests. You know, we're really judged by how we behave every day. And so it's not possible to say that you stand for democracy and human rights and actually not stand for it in Bahrain and the day after the peace accord in Egypt, but stand for it the next month somewhere else. And people notice the difference. I think what is still unclear, and you know, to me it is a great loss that when so much of the Middle East and Arab countries, and these are not definitely all the Islamic countries, but when they're going through revolutions and striving every day in increasingly difficult circumstances to achieve societies based on many of the characteristics of the United States, that the United States is not only not the model to those striving for social change, but sadly is actually the enemy of those people striving for social change. I think we still don't realize what are the consequences of that for U.S. hard and soft power. And we'll see, you know, because it's unfolding, you know, it's unfolding, it's different every day. And this is something we just don't know. But I think all of these issues of how aid is done, how empires are handled, how civil society relates to government, they all really come together, and they're all in flux right now.